We need to have a very serious, adult conversation about a number that you see flashing on debt clocks and in angry headlines, but which very few people actually analyze as a systemic threat. That number is $34 trillion. It is the national debt of the United States. Now, usually, when politicians talk about this, they use it as a bludgeon to cut Social Security or to deny funding for school lunches. They treat it like a household credit card bill. But the U.S. national debt is not a credit card bill. It is a geological force that is now reshaping the entire geopolitical landscape. We have reached a mathematical tipping point in the history of American capitalism. For the first time in history, the United States government is spending more money just to pay the interest on its debt than it spends on its entire national defense budget. Think about what that means. The cost of the past, the cost of paying for yesterday's wars, yesterday's tax cuts for the rich, and yesterday's bailouts, is now consuming the resources needed for today's survival. This creates a terrified panic within the ruling class. They look at the spreadsheets in the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department, and they see a terminal diagnosis. The debt is growing exponentially, but the real economy, the productive economy of manufacturing and goods, is stagnant. When a system reaches this stage of financial saturation, where it literally has to borrow money just to pay the interest on the money it already borrowed, it has two choices. Choice A is to default, to admit bankruptcy, which would collapse the global financial system and destroy the wealth of the billionaire class instantly. That is unacceptable to them. Choice B is to find a new source of massive, tangible wealth to inject into the system to keep the bubble inflated for a few more years. This is the terrifying reality of why we are looking at Venezuela. We are not looking at Venezuela because of democracy. We are not looking at Venezuela because of human rights. We are looking at Venezuela because the U.S. ledger is bleeding red ink, and the U.S. empire needs a massive infusion of capital to prevent a cardiac arrest. The $34 trillion debt is the gun pointed at the head of the American economy, and the war machine has decided that the only way to unload that gun is to pull the trigger on a resource-rich nation in the global south. To understand this present moment, we have to be willing to look at history without the rose-colored glasses of American exceptionalism. We have to look at history as materialists. Throughout the last 2,000 years, every major empire that has dominated the world economy has eventually hit this exact wall. It happened to the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. It happened to the Spanish Empire in the 17th century. It happened to the British Empire in the 20th century. The pattern is always the same. The empire expands, it becomes wealthy, it deindustrializes as it relies on tribute from its colonies, and it finances its luxury through debt. Eventually, the debt becomes unpayable. The bankers in the imperial core start to panic. And historically, what is the response to domestic insolvency? It is external conquest. War is effectively a bankruptcy proceeding for empires. It is a violent restructuring of the balance sheet. When Rome ran out of gold to pay its legions and its creditors, it invaded Dacia to seize its gold mines. When the British Empire faced financial crises, it didn't cut its budget. It tightened its grip on India and forced the opium trade on China to balance its trade deficit. We are seeing this same archaic, brutal logic play out today, but with modern technology. The United States has a financial sector that is bloated and insolvent. It has printed trillions of dollars that are backed by nothing but confidence. To restore that confidence, to convince the creditors in Tokyo, London, and Riyadh that the U.S. is still a good bet, the U.S. needs to demonstrate that it controls the tangible assets of the planet. This is what we call accumulation by dispossession. The system cannot generate enough profit through normal trade to pay its debts, so it must resort to theft. A war in Venezuela is not a political disagreement, it is a raid. It is a bank robber kicking down the door not because he hates the teller, but because he owes money to a loan shark. The U.S. war machine is the collection agent for the bond market, and they have identified Venezuela as the only asset large enough to cover the interest payments on the American decline. Let's be very specific about the prize. Why Venezuela? Why not some other country? The answer lies in the geology and the specific requirements of the U.S. dollar system. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the entire world. Larger than Saudi Arabia. Larger than Russia. Larger than the United States. We are talking about over 300 billion barrels of oil. At current market prices, that is tens of trillions of dollars of wealth sitting just beneath the surface of the Caribbean coast. In the eyes of Wall Street and the planners at the Pentagon, that oil does not belong to the Venezuelan people. In their view, that oil is distressed collateral. You see, the US dollar is a fiat currency. It is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. But as the debt explodes to $34 trillion, that faith is evaporating. The world is asking, what exactly backs this currency? If the United States were to successfully invade Venezuela, overthrow its government, and privatize its state oil company, PDVSA, handing the rights over to ExxonMobil and Chevron, the equation changes overnight. Suddenly, the US empire effectively controls the global energy spigot. It adds a massive asset to its implicit balance sheet. It sends a message to every bondholder in the world, don't worry about our debt. We control the oil. We control the energy that powers the world economy. Your dollars are safe because they are backed by our ability to seize the resources necessary to honor them. This is why the rhetoric against Maduro heats up exactly when the economic indicators in the US cool down. Venezuela is the ultimate collateral. It is the golden goose that the US needs to capture to keep its own Ponzi scheme running. The tragedy is that the Venezuelan people are sitting on top of the treasure chest that the American empire desperately needs to loot to pay for its own excesses. We also need to analyze the internal mechanics of the US economy to understand the drive for this war. We live in a time of deep economic stagnation for the working class. Wages are flat. Infrastructure is crumbling. The productive capacity of the United States has been hollowed out by 40 years of neoliberalism. We don't make things anymore, we import them. But there is one exception. There is one sector of the US economy that is world-class, state-subsidized, and politically untouchable, the military-industrial complex. This brings us to the concept of military Keynesianism. John Maynard Keynes famously argued that in a depression, the government should spend money to create jobs. In the US, we have a twisted version of this. The government refuses to spend money on high-speed rail, or green energy, or public housing, because those things compete with the private sector or are deemed socialist. However, the government has no problem spending unlimited amounts of money on war. War is the only bipartisan stimulus package available. A war in Venezuela would require a massive mobilization. It would require billions in missiles, billions in logistics, billions in new naval deployments. This money flows from the Treasury directly into the accounts of Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, and General Dynamics. But it also flows into the factories in Ohio, Alabama, and Texas that build these weapons. For a political class that has no solution to the economic misery of its voters, war is a convenient fake solution. It creates a temporary economic boom. It creates jobs. It pumps liquidity into the system. The $34 trillion debt implies that austerity is coming, but the war machine offers an alternative. Don't cut spending, just spend it on bombs. A war in Venezuela is a way to juice the GDP figures, to hide the recession, and to transfer massive amounts of wealth from the taxpayer to the defense contractors, all under the guise of national security. It is an addiction. The US economy is addicted to the stimulus of bloodshed, and Venezuela is the next fix. Finally, we must discuss the most immediate pain point for the American voter: inflation. We are told that inflation is caused by supply chains or too much demand. But at its core, inflation in a capitalist system is a conflict over who pays for the crisis. Right now, the American worker is paying. Prices at the grocery store and the gas station are destroying the standard of living. The Federal Reserve is trying to crush inflation by raising interest rates, which hurts workers by making mortgages and credit cards expensive. But there is another way to lower inflation that the imperial planners prefer: plunder. Energy is the master input. The price of oil determines the price of food, fertilizer and transport, the price of plastic, the price of everything. If the United States can seize control of Venezuelan oil production, it can break the power of OPEC. It can flood the market with millions of barrels of stolen, cheap Venezuelan crude. This would drive down the price of gas at the pump in the US. It would lower the cost of doing business for Amazon and Walmart. It would act as a massive subsidy to the American economy, extracted directly from the soil of Venezuela. This is the colonial model updated for the 21st century. Instead of taxing the rich in America to solve the economic crisis, the plan is to steal the wealth of the global South to subsidize the cost of living in the North. They want to lower your gas prices not by being efficient, but by seizing the assets of a sovereign nation. They are trying to bribe the American working class with cheap oil paid for with Venezuelan blood. It is a moral abomination, but historically, it is exactly how dying empires try to stave off domestic unrest. They export the misery, and they import the plunder. We have established the economic necessity for this war, the debt, the need for collateral, and the addiction to military spending. Now, we must look at how the war machine prepares the battlefield. Long before the first missile is fired, a war is fought in the minds of the American public. This is what Noam Chomsky called manufacturing consent. You can see it happening right now in real time. Suddenly, the news cycle is flooded with stories about Venezuela. Suddenly, politicians who cannot find Venezuela on a map are deeply concerned about human rights in Caracas. We have to ask ourselves, why now? There are dictatorships all over the world that the US supports. We send billions of dollars to Saudi Arabia, a monarchy that beheads dissidents. We support military juntas in Africa when they favor our mining companies. So why is Venezuela the unique target of this moral outrage? It is because the narrative is being engineered to match the economic timeline of the debt crisis. The demonization of the target is a necessary step to justify the theft. They cannot say, we are going to invade Venezuela to steal their oil because we are broke. That is too honest. Instead, they say, we are going to liberate the Venezuelan people. This propaganda blitz serves a very specific function. It dehumanizes the enemy and it silences domestic opposition. If you stand up and say, no, this is a war for oil, you are accused of supporting a dictator. It is a trap designed to manufacture a consensus for violence. The media, owned by the same corporate conglomerates that benefit from the war, acts as the amplifier. They show you images of poverty in Venezuela, poverty largely caused by US sanctions, by the way, and use those images to justify a bombing campaign that will only increase the poverty. It is a cynical, closed loop of destruction, where the US breaks a country's legs and then invades it claiming to be the ambulance. Once the consent is manufactured and the government falls, what comes next? We don't have to guess. We have the blueprints. The plan is privatization by conquest. In the eyes of Wall Street, the greatest crime of the Venezuelan government is not authoritarianism, it is that they nationalized the oil industry. PDVSA, the state oil company, uses its revenues to fund the state. The goal of a US intervention is to break PDVSA into pieces and sell it off to private capital. Imagine the fire sale. ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, and the massive asset managers like BlackRock are already calculating the returns. They are looking at fields of crude oil that cost pennies to extract and selling them at global market prices. This is the greatest transfer of wealth imaginable. It is the looting of a nation's birthright. And it won't just be oil. It will be gold, it will be bauxite, it will be the electricity grid. This is the shock doctrine that Naomi Klein warned us about. They use the shock of war to impose economic policies that would never be accepted democratically. They will install a puppet government that will sign contracts written in New York and London. These contracts will lock Venezuela into a colonial economic model for the next 100 years. They will call it opening the market or restoring investor confidence, but let's call it what it is piracy. It is the violent seizure of public assets for private gain. And for the US economy, it provides a temporary influx of cheap resources that allows the dying system to limp along for another decade, while the people of Venezuela are left with a hollowed-out shell of a country. We must also look at the domestic utility of this war. The United States is currently a powder keg of social unrest. We have a housing crisis where millions cannot afford rent. We have an opioid epidemic killing 100,000 people a year. We have a healthcare system that bankrupts the sick. The American dream is dead for anyone under the age of 40. When a ruling class cannot solve the problems of its own people, it has historically tried to unify them against a foreign enemy. A war in Venezuela serves as the ultimate distraction machine. It sucks the oxygen out of the room. Instead of talking about why there is no money for schools, the news talks about the threat from Caracas. Instead of organizing unions to fight for better wages, workers are encouraged to support the troops. It directs the anger of the population outward, away from the oligarchs who are actually destroying their lives, and toward a foreign bogeyman who has done nothing to them. This is the oldest trick in the book. If you can't give the people bread, give them a circus. And the modern circus is high-tech warfare broadcast on cable news. It makes the American public feel powerful, it makes them feel like they are part of a great moral crusade, all while their pockets are being picked by the defense contractors. The war is not just about securing oil, it is about securing social stability at home by exporting violence abroad. It is a valve to release the pressure of a failing society. However, this time, the calculation is incredibly dangerous. The planners in Washington are operating on an outdated map. They still think it is 1990. They still think they can invade a country in the Caribbean and no one can stop them. They are wrong. Venezuela is not Grenada. It is not Panama. Venezuela has powerful friends. Russia and China have loaned billions of dollars to Venezuela. They have invested heavily in its oil infrastructure. They view Venezuela as a strategic partner in the Western Hemisphere. If the United States invades, it is not just attacking Maduro, it is attacking the investments of Beijing and Moscow. We have already seen Russian nuclear-capable bombers landing in Caracas. We have seen Chinese diplomatic support. By trying to solve its debt crisis through war, the United States risks triggering a global conflict. This is the insanity of the dying empire. To pay off its $34 trillion debt, it is willing to risk World War III. China and Russia know that if Venezuela falls, they are next. They know that the US strategy is to pick off the BRICS nations one by one. They will not blink. They will not simply stand by and watch their ally be devoured. The arrogance of the US war machine is blinding them to the reality that the world fights back now. We are walking toward a cliff edge, led by people who are looking at their stock portfolios instead of the geopolitical reality. So, we reach the conclusion. We must be absolutely clear. The enemy is not a bus driver in Caracas named Nicolas Maduro. The enemy is not socialism. The enemy is a specific economic system, US monopoly capitalism, that has run out of room to grow peacefully. It is a system that acts like a cancer. It must expand, it must consume, or it dies. The $34 trillion debt is the tumor. The war in Venezuela is the desperate attempt to feed that tumor. If we want to stop this war, we cannot just argue about foreign policy. We have to argue about the system itself. We have to demand an economy that is not based on debt, not based on endless growth, and not based on imperial plunder. We need a people's default. We need to say that we will not kill millions of people in the global south just to satisfy the bond market. We need to invest in our own country, in our own people, and transition away from the militarized economy that is holding us hostage. The war machine tries to tell you that the choice is between war and poverty. That is a lie. The choice is between empire and democracy. We cannot have both. As long as our economy requires the theft of Venezuelan oil to function, we are not a free people, we are mercenaries for the billionaire class. It is time to break the machine before it breaks the world.